Here are our learning goals. Explain the parts of an experiment, including the control group, the experimental group, the dependent variable, the independent variable, and constants. So let's take an example. Let's say students wanted to see the effect of fertilizer on how high bean plants would grow. So here's what they did. They took two pots. Each pot was exactly the same. They took some soil and they filled each pot with the same amount of soil. They used the same type of soil in each pot. They put 4 bean seeds in each pot. They planted them to the same depth. They used the same type of beans. In fact, they used beans from the same seed package so that they could make the seeds as similar as they possibly could. They applied the same amount of water to each pot at the same time every day. To one pot, they added fertilizer. The only difference between this group and this group is the fertilizer. We call the fertilizer the independent variable. It's a variable that we've changed. It's the only difference between this group and this group. So we give each group a name. The group that has the independent variable, in this case the fertilizer, we call the experimental group. The group that does not have the independent variable, that's missing the independent variable, we call the control group. So the only difference between the experimental group and the control group is the independent variable. It's the variable that I change, the independent variable, the IV. That's its nickname. If we look at the two groups and take away the independent variable, they should be exactly the same. For an experiment to be valid, the only difference between these two groups should be the independent variable. So the things that are exactly the same between the experimental group and the control group, we call the constants. Right? So the pots, the soil, the seeds, the water, those are all constants because they're the same between each group. At the end of the experiment, we're going to have 2 bean plants and we're going to measure them to see how high they got. So from the experimental group, we got this bean plant and we're going to measure it with this metric ruler and we find out that it's 12 centimeters high. The bean plant from the control group, we measure and we find out it's 5.5 centimeters tall. This is what we call the dependent variable because it depends on the independent variable. The independent variable should be the only difference between our two groups. It should be the only thing that makes a difference between the two different heights of the bean plants. The thing that we're going to measure, count, or observe at the end of the experiment is called the dependent variable. So in this experiment, the dependent variable. So in this experiment, the thing that we're going to measure, count, or observe at the end is the height of the bean plants. So that's our dependent variable. All right, so hit pause, answer these questions, and when you're ready, hit play. What is the only difference between the experimental group and the control group? The only difference should be the independent variable. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that everything else is exactly the same. then we know that any difference in the dependent variable, the thing we're going to count, measure, or observe at the end, is due to the independent variable and not some other difference between the two groups. What are the constants in an experiment? The constants are the things that are the same between the experimental group and the control group. So everything besides the independent variable is a constant. The pot, the soil, the amount of water, how much water we use, the seeds, all those things are constants in this experiment. What is the dependent variable in an experiment? The dependent variable is the thing that we're going to count, measure, or observe at the end. In this case, it was how high the bean plants got. The dependent variable is going to be affected by the independent variable and is going to respond to the independent variable. What is the independent variable in an experiment? Well, the independent variable is the thing that I change, the IV, the independent variable. So in this case, it's the fertilizer. But in every experiment, the independent variable is going to be the difference between the control group and the experimental group. The control group and experimental group should be exactly the same, except for the independent variable.